Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. Today, David Cameron gets a letter from Tory backbenchers demanding that he take back control of more than 100 laws from the EU. Just another little shred of news in the ongoing world of Westminster, except that it speaks to a wider sense of unease on the Conservative side of politics, which was summed up by yesterday's Sunday Telegraph. That said that in his eagerness for popularity, the Prime Minister runs the risk of turning his back on the fundamental values of the party he leads. Current areas of concern include the environment, there's a lot of hostility to wind farms, Europe, foreign aid, anti-business rhetoric and much else. Well, today we're going to ask what those fundamental values are, or should be, for British Conservatives. I'm joined by the modernising Tory MP Margo James, the Conservative columnist Peter Hitchens, Conservative but not exactly a loyal foot soldier, I think it's fair to say, the author of Pity the Billionaire Thomas Frank, who's been analysing the Tea Party insurgency on the American right, and the champion of British neoconservatism, Douglas Murray. Let's start with you, Douglas, because ideology is a good place to begin, and the mere question of whether British Conservatives should have a coherent ideology is something that Conservatives argue about.
Absolutely. Conservatism itself, you could argue, is an anti-ideological ideology. It doesn't want to engage in the doctrines that the left, for instance, engages in. However, I would argue that the right, Conservatives, have to have a defined ideology, not least in recent decades, because the onslaught from the left has been so intense and so far-reaching in its consequences that you cannot rebut it solely by non-ideology alone.
And that means that if you are somebody like David Cameron at the helm, you need kind of strong underpinnings to ensure that you're not just buffeted by events.
I think you'd need to know where you're coming from.
And so, in its essence, neoconservatism for a British audience means what?
Well, neoconservatism is simply a brand of conservatism, but which is propelled by the desire to conserve, and in neoconservatism's case would also believe in certain situations, such as foreign affairs, being rather more proactive, perhaps, than traditional small-c conservatism.
Peter Hitchens, you would regard yourself, you called yourself in the past a paleo-conservative rather than a neo-conservative.
Well,
paleo meaning old,
people call me that. It's not. It's just a term to try and distinguish myself, apart from anything else, from Douglas and his mad foreign adventures that he's so strangely keen on. But it is really just, I'm a conservative. That is to say, I don't believe that all progress is good, that I believe many things which now exist deserve to be preserved, and that some things which used to exist ought to be restored. And I have a fairly sound basis for that belief in experience and in a very, very strong love of my own country, which I see now very sorely distressed. And that's where my conservatism comes from.
And what about ideology? Would you go back to a body of writing, philosophical writing or other writing, you'd say this is sort of ideologically where I come from, or is it in all instinctual?
No, I think the foundation of conservatism does come from Christianity, but that is not an ideology. It's a religion, and amongst other things, it limits the ambitions of man. It says that God's kingdom is not of this world, and utopias are always wrong. The problem is that, as Douglas rightly said, we confront utopians all the time, and especially since the end of the 19th century, when Fabianism became a very strong strand in English politics, and then since the Second World War, when the sort of cultural Marxism of the 1960s revolution moved into radical politics. If you don't understand your enemy, and if you don't understand what it is that he's seeking to do, you won't be able to combat him. And an awful lot of conservatism is simply a machine for obtaining office for the sons of gentlemen, rather than a party which looks at the country and says, this is what's wrong with it, this is what needs to be put right, and this is what we could do better.
Let's turn to a daughter of gentlemen who's successfully sought office under the Conservative machine, Margo James. Does ideology matter to you? Do you think it's an important thing to be talking about for Conservatives?
I don't think ideology is at the root of conservatism, in that Marxism might be said to be at the root of socialism, which is a pretty rigid framework of an ideology. Conservatism, I would define more as a philosophy. And I think it has its roots in the philosophers of the 18th and 19th century, Burke and Mill. And then more recently, when, fast forwarding really to the 1960s and 70s, when Britain was the sick man of Europe economically, there was a big need to save the country. And the Conservative Party under Margaret Thatcher then looked to a basis of action which had its roots more in a sense of economic freedom.
Small state and smaller
exactly,
state.
Exactly.
Yeah. Giving it an American perspective, Thomas Frank, you've been looking at the Tea Party insurgency, I called it, but the phenomenon on the right that after a period of economic crisis caused by the failure of regulation and greed in the banking sector and all the rest of it, so many Americans turn not to social democratic or leftish solutions, but to conservative ones.
That's right. And first of all, thanks for having me here. And, you know, I'm listening to your descriptions of the UK, and I would say that in America, the situation is precisely the reverse. There really isn't any kind of left in the way that you guys are describing the left here in the United States. But you do have on the right, you have a movement that is, you know, powerfully ideological. And the ideology in that case, I mean, they call themselves conservative, whether they, you know, neocon or paleocon, I don't know. The ideology is the market. Now, this is fascinating in all sorts of ways. First of all, the sort of utopian hold, the grip that it has on the minds of the you know, the leaders of the American right. I'm reminded of a speech that Rick Santorum gave the other day. This is the guy, a former senator from Pennsylvania, who's running for the presidency in the Republican Party, where he said something that was absolutely contrary to what we know to be true about the world we live in, which is he's talking about the financial crisis, the housing bubble of 2008 and before. And he says, we know what caused that. Government forced banks to hand out bad loans to poor people. Okay, this is, as a matter of fact, not true. It's very well established that it's not true. But he says, we know this is the case. We don't, and what he means by that is we don't really need to look any further because our ideology explains the situation to us, okay? We know that markets always work and that if you just get government out of the way, everything's going to be fine. And the other thing I want to point out about this is that this is a profoundly unconservative ideology. There's nothing more destructive of, you know, inherited traditions than, you know, the free operations of the market.
I'd like to pick up directly on the market and look at what's happened to this country over the last few years, where we did have many people would say an under-regulated financial system, and we now have a far bigger gap between a few people earning vast amounts of money right at the top, and the controversy at the moment about what bank bosses and others are being paid, and the average wage. Now, what I want to see is whether there is a distinction made among the Conservatives around the table as to whether this is virtuous, the market acting in a virtuous way, or whether there is indeed something anti-conservative about that. Peter.
Well, it's extraordinary, the confusion which has happened. It happened in the era of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, particularly among political conservatives, who seemed to think that the market was a substitute for Christianity, that somehow or other was this force, the invisible hand, that would, if left to its own devices, create a good society. These people were completely uninterested in matters of morals and culture, and completely uninterested, it seemed to me, in preserving the particularity and independence of their own countries, and mistook 19th century liberalism for conservatism. And from that grave mistake, an awful lot has followed. I have anything whatsoever in common with almost anything that Margo has said. And I look at outfits like the Tea Party in the United States, and I have nothing in common with them. They don't have any interest in the things that interest me, which are, as I say, in preserving culture, in preserving and extending morality and such things as the family and the small particular things of life in which people can be free. And this is nothing whatever to do with conservatism, and it's a perversion of the cause, which has almost completely destroyed it as a political force in both the United States and in Britain.
You are a liberal, small L, Margo, not a conservative. question?
Certainly not, no. I think that perhaps I have much more in common with some of the things that Peter wants to conserve than he thinks I have. I think virtually all my colleagues in the Conservative Party, whether in Parliament or not, see the preservation of our civic institutions and the role of the monarchy and the family as absolutely paramount. I don't think that the market has replaced conservatism. I think the market is crucial in terms of rewarding people for hard work and enterprise, which is a central tenet of conservatism. But it is certainly not the only thing. I mean, the very word conservative derives from conserve, and we are just as much about conserving as we are about innovating.
But there is a great wrenching happening, isn't there, at the moment, between the demands of the global market, we are told, where you don't get people to run big businesses or big banks unless they're paid vast rewards, and the anger, the resentment, the disappointment felt by millions and millions of, as it were, culturally conservative people rooted in countries like this one, who see them, disappearing into a kind of parallel world. And the question, in the end, whose side are you on in that struggle? Can't be avoided.
Well, I think that it is not a new problem, Andrew. I can remember back in the 70s, it was the same. I would say that there is a slight creeping return of the politics of envy, which concerns me greatly. Yes, some of these salaries are absolutely remote from all of us around this table, I would imagine, and certainly average salary, people on average salaries. But I mean, one of the main changes since those days of the 70s has been the globalisation of many industries. And we do have to have an eye to the preservation of jobs in this country. And if we go too far out on a limb in taxing those large salaries, as the Labour Party is suggesting at the moment,
you just lose the company.
I fear that very much.
You're a millionaire because you built your own company, aren't you? I mean, I should say you're not a millionaire because somebody has paid you huge sums of money to sit on boards and mess up companies, because you built your own ones.
That is true, and I sometimes reflect that it probably took me about 15 years to build my business before I sold it, and it took me 15 years to earn what one of these bankers earns in a year or two. I have no resentment of that. I didn't have the sort of financial brain to go into banking. Neither did I want to sell my soul to a corporate institution, which is what it takes at that level of that industry. They are on tap 16 to 18 hours a day, Christmas Day, whatever. They have to sacrifice their entire lives for it.
No time.
No, and it would not be my choice of a way to live, and I would prefer a way to live which is perhaps less financially remunerative.
Douglas Murray.
And one of the things that used to be said by some conservatives here and in America after the Cold War was that the right had won the economic conflict and that the left had won the culture wars. And actually this boast, half boast as it were, has come back to bite those conservatives who argued it, because there's no doubt that, I think wrongly, the right has been saddled with the mistakes that have gone on in recent years, have been to a large extent blamed for excesses within the market that we have seen in both in America and in the UK. And I think that's a serious problem that conservatism is going to have to get over. And it's going to have to be a culture war, as it were, that it's going to have to fight itself. I just wanted to put in one other as it were, pillar of conservatism which is worth discussing, which is the issue of institutions. The idea that the market is the institution, that the market will do, that's enough, is of course a terrible mistake. Societies and conservative societies are made up partly by their reliance on a whole range of institutions, the rule of law, the law courts, the monarchy in the case of Britain, a parliament, a working parliament that actually does the job that parliament's meant to do. All of these things which, if you actually look at Britain in particular today, you can't help but come to the conclusion that at the very least all of these institutions have been significantly debased, and at the root of that is, I think, the reason why some people end up relying on the idea that only one institution, the market, can take us out of this malaise.
Is there a sense amongst you all that we are actually at a potentially important turning point anyway, that you know, because of levels of indebtedness, our inability to create enough wealth in the West and so on, there is going to have to be a radically different settlement, and therefore this is an opportunity for people on the right as for people on the left to kind of pile in and start to make some more.
Well, it's certainly at a moment of, I think, permanent national decline. I think that a lot of people have until recently viewed the current crisis as a temporary thing which will come to an end, like the one we had in the 1980s, and then we'll all get back to being prosperous again. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to be comparatively less well off, comparatively less powerful, comparatively less almost everything, which may concentrate people's minds. But on the other hand, I think one has also to look at the fact that there's been a huge ideological victory of liberalism and of what I style cultural Marxism as a way of simply lumping together all the forces of, for instance, political correctness, anti-family, multiculturalism, which have taken over almost all discourse in this country, which make it very, very difficult to combat these things, because the platform from which you could once have done it, a conservative platform of a sovereign independent nation with working institutions and traditions, has almost completely been wiped out. And both the main political parties have also been taken over by neoliberalism in internal putsches. So there's almost no room, particularly in the Conservative Party, for any genuine conservative discourse.
If I can say, the reason why we're at such a juncture, in my opinion, is why this matters, is because, among other things, there is a risk at the moment that people will rely on the idea that the only thing that has got us where we are is, for instance, Fred Goodwin. The only thing that has got us where we are a few bankers and so on. And whilst the catastrophe within the banking sector is undoubtedly a factor, we will not get through this period if we do not also recognise the fact that government without the banking bailout has been so vastly overspending that it is unsustainable anyway. If you are borrowing, as we have already this fiscal year, more than 100 billion without anything to do with the banking bailout, that should be a warning something is going wrong in your spending.
But the origin of that, this is so important, I have to push in here. The origin of that is not just a decision to spend lots more money. The origin of it was the decision in the 1960s that the state should become the parent.
Yes.
That more and more people should be married to the state, that the family should become less and less important. And the reason why we have such a huge number of people dependent upon the welfare state is this deliberate decision to create, and now to continue to creating endlessly, fatherless families which the state is responsible for. That's the reason why the entire product of the income tax is now spent on welfare.
I think that was a wince, Margo James, rather than a nod.
Well, I
of
think it is a
approbation.
perverse way of looking at the world to allege that these negative social consequences have been all at the door of government policy, as if there is a political party or a government that is trying to create fatherless families. Absolutely not. And I think that the roots of the problem are much more diverse than government policy. There have been a lot of social change, and this government is trying, through welfare reform, to address some of the problems.
Thomas Frank, how would this conversation feel if it was happening in America? Is there more pessimism in British conservatism than you hear in American conservatism?
No, absolutely. But look, the turning point you referred to a minute ago, America hit that turning point and just didn't turn. Okay, the turning point is basically the complete destruction of 30 years of economic policy. All the financial deregulation, the desupervision, all of the ways in which we encouraged financial experimentation. That's been our economic policy in America for 30 years. At the expense of places like where I grew up, which is now referred to as the Rust Belt. Okay, and this economic policy completely crashes and burns in 2008. Is revealed to be absolutely worthless. And what do? We bail out the banks, set them back up, make sure these guys get their bonuses, set them back up and get them started again. And this is both parties accept this policy. Okay, for the Republicans engineer it at first, President Bush, and then President Obama comes in and accepts this. You referred earlier to sort of class outrage, the sense of outrage at the billionaire class. That is palpable in America. It is everywhere you go in America. What's fascinating to me is that the conservative movement in America are the ones that speak to that most ably and most effectively. And that's one of the reasons that they've succeeded and why the Tea Party movement is succeeding. You go watch Newt Gingrich when, this is, who this guy is. He's running for president. And he gave a victory speech after his big win in South Carolina the other day. And I swear he mentioned elites or elitism 5 or 6 times in the course of his talk. I mean, this is the Tea Party movement imagines itself to be the great sort of rising up of the masses against the.
It's true. It's very hard to come up with a definition of elite that doesn't include Newt Gingrich.
I'm it, right? In his mind, it's like the starving journalist.
But this is just rank populism of the kind that's popular in both our countries at the moment and at risk of getting worse.
Tom's talking about the Tea Party. That goes back. The Americans' dislike of big government is visceral, isn't it? And it goes right back to the origins of the United States and the tussle between the states and the federal government. And I think there's a parallel between in the US, this dislike of big government, and in the UK, this deep concern about the European Union and Brussels. That is the sort of whipping boy for all of our discontent, in the same way as big government and federal government is for the discontent of the Tea Party movement.
I want to see whether we can connect what's happened economically. The disemboweling, if you like, of traditional manufacturing, of a lot of things that used to go on in this country in favour of financial services, financial engineering, not real engineering, and what, for instance, Peter was saying about the family and traditional structures, because it seems to a lot of people that what has happened over the last 20 years is, in effect, governments of either stripe have taken the huge tax take that was on offer during the long boom in the city and used it to buy off people through welfare and bigger state spending, and therefore have not confronted the industrial and economic problems, which were where so many people and families and breadwinners were traditionally employed.
Well, this is true, and I think if you look at both, this is one of the great mistakes which modern Conservatives make is this what I call Thatcherolatry in this country, and of course the ludicrous worship of Ronald Reagan in the United States. These were economically profoundly liberal governments. They forsook all kinds of protection. They exposed their native industries to the most disastrous competition and basically did huge damage to manufacturing industry and therefore to the livelihoods of people. And again, this hits straight at the family. In the areas where people used to work in manufacturing industry and support their families through work, you now have vast welfare deserts. And these were the creation of supposedly much worshipped conservative governments. And this is part of the huge mess that conservatism has got itself into. I must just respond to Margo on the business of fatherless families. There was actually a big ideological battle about this in the 1960s. In which the whole idea of the unmarried mother was changed into the single parent. And then there was an ideological battle in her own party during the long years of opposition in Blairism, when there was a moment where I think it was David Willetts who declared that the war on the single mother is over. There'd never been a war against single mothers. Nobody disliked single mothers. That wasn't the point. What there ought to have been was a war to re-establish the father-led family and the independence of the family from the state, if it had been a Conservative party. But by that time, it was a wholly neoliberal party, which in my view would guillotine the Queen in Trafalgar Square if it thought it would win at an election.
Can I just come in? I think there was, Peter forgets, there was a huge social stigma about being a single mother in the 70s, and even before that it was even worse. Very, very difficult to become a single mother. In the 60s, young women who were pregnant outside marriage were forced to give up their children for adoption, with terrible consequences. And then in the 70s, yes, it was just about acceptable to have the baby, but you were shunned.
Your father was adopted, wasn't he?
No, he wasn't. My partner is adopted.
Your partner's adopted.
Not my father. No.
Sorry.
No.
In fact, there was an awful lot of work going on in a book which I won't mention because this isn't a plugging program, which I wrote more than 10 years ago. I went into this business. There was an awful lot going on previously to try and alleviate the unpleasant things which were done to unmarried mothers. But that switched into a campaign to make single parenthood acceptable as a social thing, which has changed our country in such an enormous way that it is now almost unrecognisable. There are two different things. Treating people well and a social movement are two very different things.
I want to bring in Thomas Frank at this point because not that long ago, from our perspective, the American popular right was very interested in social issues.
That's right.
Abortion, the death penalty, all sorts of kind of, if you like, touchstone moral issues. and yet the Tea Party today is interested primarily and almost universally in economics, shrinking the state, in tax issues. Why has that change happened?
Well, I mean, you've got this economic slump that just won't end, and that has a tendency to push culture war issues off the front burner. The same thing happened in the 1930s. I mean, America has periodically been convulsed with culture wars. In the 1920s, we had, it was the rise of fundamentalism, and then you had prohibition, which was, this great moment and shining moment in the history of my land. And then in the 1930s, with the Depression, people forgot about that stuff as, they wanted to get rid of it as quickly as they could. And that's what happens, in moments of hard times. The culture wars disappear, but that doesn't, and that's what's going on right now. Now they'll be back, of course. The culture wars will be back as soon as the economy recovers. But this doesn't mean, and like you say, economic issues are the focus again. But this doesn't mean that we talk about economic issues in an economic way. We think about them, especially on the right, the Tea Party movement and their allies. We think about them in moral terms. In almost religious terms. Okay, we think about the national debt instead of the way an economist would think about it. We think about it as though it were the doings of a family, or we think about it in terms of 7 lean years and 7 fat years, like in the Bible. We think about Ron Paul's son Rand Paul, who's a U.S. senator from Kentucky, talks about the day of judgment that's coming to us.
Well, we may be getting 7 lean years after rather more than 7 fat years. I'm not sure the Bible's wrong on that one. Can I just bring in Douglas Murray, because in your vision of neoconservatism, you would like to slash the state right back. You'd like to cut taxes back much more radically to create a more individualistic and less state-dependent society. Are you looking at what the Conservative government is doing now? Are you just purely a voice out there in the wilderness, or do you have connections with the Conservative family which actually starts to put some of your ideas into practice?
I wouldn't want to harm the career of anyone by naming names in the Conservative Party of anyone who sympathises with what I think, but I think that I think to an extent all Conservative voices, the small c, neocon, paleocon, whatever, are to an extent in the wilderness at the moment, because we have found ourselves in a slightly similar situation to that which the States has been in for some years, which is to say that the battles have become phony battles. In the States, the argument about abortion, Roe versus Wade, come out all the time. In fact, Republican or Democrat, extremely unlikely that the abortion laws are going to change in the US. These things are fought incredibly hard, but they're actually diversionary conflicts. And in the meantime, all sorts of other things go through without anyone batting an eyelid. Again, the example of the war on single mothers. The phantom culture wars fought, whilst the real things go through unnoticed. And I think there's one, if I can say so, very good battle going on at the moment that's a real battle, and that's the one that the coalition government is involved in over whether or not you should be paid better if you work than if you don't work. And the extraordinary conflict, apart from anything else, in the House of Lords that has come across.
We should remind people, this is the £26,000
Yes.
cap, which is the maximum that a family on benefits can receive because
Yes.
it is the average wage.
And this is already being talked about
Proposal.
in entirely sentimental terms. Here is a family with 5 children who've got 30,000 a year on benefits, and therefore they will not be able to live the life they would like. The BBC did something on such a family the other day. And this diverts from the real issue, which is the terrible disincentive and the terrible disaster across society that occurs when you do not incentivize people to work, to get out there, to find, apart from anything else, nobility in providing for their dependents.
What would your welfare state look like?
It would be a safety net. It would be what the welfare state was always meant to be, or should have been, in my opinion, which is that it was a safety net that caught those in need, but that didn't become a smothering safety blanket that ended up in sending us into the situation we're currently in, where you have generation after generation of families who have not only never known work, but have never known that they ought to know work.
Would both Margo and Peter agree with that?
Well, I agree with it, but I think the whole thing is you're starting with the economics rather than the politics. I think what the current government is engaging is a brilliant piece of triangulation. If you can get attacked by the bishops, and if you can get attacked by Ed Miliband, then you will actually look as if you're Conservative when they're not. And that is there will be very little result from this much touted reform, because it doesn't, as I say, tackle the fundamental problem that we have created an enormous and growing dependent class about which no one proposes to do anything. So it has to go down to real politics. The real politics in this country are actually the politics of the family, because the fundamental. I lived in the Soviet Union for 2 years, and the thing that I noticed about it, the thing that I learnt most about what Marxism was really about there, was that the Soviet Union was the absolutely virulent, furious enemy of the married family. It hated marriage above all other things and tried to diminish it and reduce it to a tiny corner in society, because it was the principal rival to the power of the state. And when I got back here, I saw exactly the same process taking place in slow motion in my own country. And ever since the 1960s, and particularly the bizarre divorce reforms which were enacted then, which made it easier to get a divorce and to get out of a car leasing agreement, we have had the most fantastic concerted state-sponsored attack on the family, which continues to this day and is very, very expensive.
Do you recognise this at all, Margo?
Can I go back to what Douglas was saying? Because the very fact that we've got this major debate about whether families on benefits should receive as much as a working family is a sort of statement of the terrible past to which we have come. I mean, it should be so self-evident that benefits are there to support people in need, and they shouldn't be commensurate with the average earnings of a family who work. It seems to me so self-evident that it's deeply shocking that it should cause such controversy.
Absolutely.
And also I think that it does have a tremendous moral purpose, and I would completely contest what Peter has just said. How he can describe Ian Duncan Smith as not a conservative baffles me. These proposals brought out by Ian Duncan Smith had their origin in all his work in the Centre for Social Justice that he founded, to try and support families, to try and bring a moral purpose to the welfare state and make work pay.
Yeah.
That seems to me to encompass everything that the Conservative Party is about, and I feel that it is Peter who is really
I think we've gone as far on this one as we probably can.
Well, I would just say that poor old Ian Duncan Smith was thoroughly cured of conservatism when he was the victim of that tremendous putsch against him, which destroyed the last vestiges of conservatism in the Conservative Party. One of the most astonishing events in British history, and one of the least covered, and as dramatic as the putsch in the Labour Party, which destroyed old Labour and replaced it with Blairism. Fascinating events, far more interesting than any general election of the past 20 years. Not actually much examined, but Ian is not likely to recover from that experience in a short time. But in any case, he's in a party which isn't conservative or capable of conservatism. And I'll challenge you, in 5 or 6 years' time, come back and see, after your supposed grandiose reforms have gone through, come back and see if all the things that you now allege against the welfare system aren't actually still going on. I bet they are.
As I say, I think we're not going to come to a kind of easy consensus on this one. I just have an instinct for this thing after doing the programme for a while. I'd like to move on to two other very difficult areas in conservative thinking at the moment. One, it might seem small, wind farms, where you have on the one hand a great deal of pressure from the EU, from the government, from people who are particularly worried about the effects of man-made climate change, to get more and more and more wind farms grow. And on the other hand, you've got a sort of rebellion from what could be called, if I can use his name without him being here, sort of Roger Scruton, small green conservatism, traditionalism, rural conservatism, who said that we don't have much of green England or green Britain left these days, and this is a wanton sort of urban attack on it.
Well, I was asked by the Conservative Women's Organisation, which is a very traditional wing of the party, or was at the time, 6 or 7 years ago, to go and speak on the greening of the Conservative Party, which was presented at the time as such a new direction for the party. And when I was preparing my talk, I thought, well, it's actually not new at all. I mean, my
asphyxiated huskies all over the place.
My parents were brought me up in the just after the war, and it was waste not, want not. A stitch in time serves 9. You'd never dream of leaving the house without turning the lights off. These are the whole philosophy is not new, but I think that the trouble with the wind farm issue is that it is seen as too much, too quick, and how a big question over its efficacy. Should we not be looking more at offshore wind? Should we not be looking more at marine energy and also conservation? and of course the protection of the countryside.
Of course, for a lot of Conservatives, they've been late into this debate, I think, for a very clear reason, which is that the green issue, the green agenda, as it were, was seen rightly by many of them to have been hijacked by so-called watermelons, people who were green on the outside but very red on the inside. And that to an extent this scared a lot of Conservatives off dealing with that issue. Plus the fact,
but wrongly.
Wrongly. But plus the fact that many watermelons were sort of attacking conservative institutions and conservative ideas, and a lot of Conservatives thought, well, in that case, we must defend, the oil companies, or we must defend, and came up with it. Actually, they ended up on very weak terrain. I think that the Conservative policy here can be defined, apart from anything else, in opposition to what one might call Prescottism, which is the idea that in order to satisfy our future energy needs, we must build over the last remaining bits of Britain that are worth looking at, and say that we need in perpetuity so much energy that we'll no longer have any green land that we'd want to look at. I think that the Scrutonian vision of this, that actually green conservatism comes from the local community, it comes from individuals, it doesn't rely on big government for solutions, it relies on itself, is a very worthwhile one.
This leads to something that isn't talked about very much at all, which is the relationship between conservatism and consumerism. Is it possible to have proper conservatism in a rampantly consumerist economy?
No, I don't think it is. I think conservatism would restrain that, as it would restrain an awful lot of other things if we actually had.
Thomas Frank.
Well, no. If in America, anyways, where the guiding principle of conservatism, as we've been talking about, is markets. Right? There's absolutely nothing you can do about these things, or very little that you can do about these things. And here we get back to Newt Gingrich's word elitist. Okay, to have the kind of policies that you're describing would be antithetical to conservatism in America, because these are acts of elitism by necessity, because they militate against the market.
Does America not nonetheless have a much stronger network of faith-based, community-based, charitable and local action, which in some ways acts as a brake on the more extreme aspects of consumerism?
I wouldn't know whether it's stronger or weaker here. I would say that consumerism in the sort of traditional sense of shopping malls and TV commercials and whatnot is very powerful in the United States. You even have sort of green consumerism. So you have, if you take a couple steps back, many years ago.
But real family incomes haven't grown, have they?
What, in the last couple of years?
Yeah, average family incomes.
No, of course not.
Or since the 70s, actually.
And that's right. And sort of blue-collar incomes haven't grown in a very long time. That's exactly correct. One of the sort of fascinating things about America, and I'm sure the same thing is the case here, is the way in which consumer society has sort of grabbed hold of and captured certain critiques of itself. Okay, so you're talking about various environmental issues, and we of course have green consumerism in America. But also, I keep all these issues that you're talking about, Peter Hitchens, of the family and all the ways in which tradition are just is just so massively insulted all the time. In America, it's not the political system that does that. It's the culture. It's the mass culture. It's the consumer culture that does that.
The political system has played its part.
But you just turn on the TV and it's just a slap in the face,
Sure, yes, and I don't disagree with any of that. I hate television. I wish it had never been invented. I'm always amazed at the way that conservatives are not as suspicious of television or motor cars, all kinds of other destructive forces as they used to be. I ride a bicycle for conservative reasons, not because I want to please some idiot warmist who thinks we're all going to be drowned by melting ice caps, which is a fantasy. But because I actually think that it's a good thing to do for myself, and I would recommend it to other people. And that's the way that a conservative environmentalist would seem to me to operate, rather than peppering the country with windmills which don't even work when it's cold.
Margo.
I think there is a huge tension between consumerism and the market and conservatism, and I think it's something we wrestle with, particularly with regard to town centres at the moment, and the drive to out-of-town supermarket shopping and all of that tension. But can I just make one point about the way I think that we can harness the power of markets to deliver social ends? We've got social investment bonds as a new concept, and there's an example of, I think it's in Peterborough, where there's a prison and it's being run by the private sector now, and there's investors are investing in that prison's effectiveness by buying bonds and raising capital.
You could do this for schools and
Yes,
hospitals.
rising
so
capital.
grotesque.
But
That's so
can I just finish,
grotesque.
Peter? Because
Sure.
raising capital to fund the sort of offender behaviour programmes to rehabilitate people, and in times of such straitened public finances, the prison's budget is very limited. Why not bring in private capital from people who want to do some good with their investment?
Because the punishment of wrongdoers is a moral activity, not a commercial occupation. The two seem to me to be utterly distinct.
But it
And
is
you
not.
You could not conceivably confuse the two, and I can't see how a conservative could not be repelled by the idea that you could farm out for
Okay.
jobs.
Absolutely.
the punishment of wrongdoers.
There are very few things that the state alone can or should do. One of them is to raise an army, one of them is to provide a police force, one of them is to provide prisons. The idea that private sector should be brought in to run prisons so that the government can look after all the really important things like building out welfare strikes me as being a
We do it all the
crazy
time in America.
inversion.
It's all over the place.
Horrible.
Privatization of prisons.
And they sit there out on the
It's-
plains
it's,
in empty
you know,
prisons hoping for more
it's-
crime.
yeah, exactly. They
Well,
have a vested
I-
interest.
They don't work very well, and everyone can leave
I think
anytime
we
they
should.
want.
I think we should hang fire and see how much more effective they are at delivering rehabilitated offenders, and does it cut the recidivist rate?
Yes.
And the early signs are that it will, and we should hang fire before
I love
we
that
make
word.
these.
Do you want to hear a
It's
funny
so
story?
Blairite.
No anecdotes.
We'd love to hear a funny
It's
story,
about a
but
private prison.
we're about to run out of time. I'm afraid, and we haven't even really properly talked about Europe, which was where we were going to go next. But it's been a very, very interesting conversation. Thank you, all of you. We've got Margo James, the Conservative MP, Peter Hitchens, who can be read in the Mail on Sunday and other places on a regular basis, and whose books are in bookshops, probably even now. Douglas Murray.
Not often they're not.
Not often, but rarely. Douglas Murray, whose latest book looks at the Bloody Sunday inquiry, and Thomas Frank's Pity the Billionaire is out now. Next week, we're going to be talking about the Elizabethans, not the Roughs, not the Shakespeare, but modern times, with Max Hastings, Mary Beard and John Guy. But for now, thank you and goodbye. Thank you for listening to this Radio 4 podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you might like to try others like it, such as In Our Time or Thinking Aloud, both of which are also available from the Radio 4 website.